The morning of June 15, 2018, began like any other at Carter Manufacturing. The humid Kentucky air hung heavy around the aging factory building, its red brick walls absorbing the early summer heat. Inside, James Carter adjusted his safety goggles, his weathered hands moving with practiced precision across the control panel. 20 years at the same station had taught him to notice even the slightest irregularity in the machinery's rhythm. Something felt off that morning. The subtle vibration beneath his feet wasn't right. James glanced at the pressure gauges, his experienced eyes catching the barely perceptible flutter of the needles. In the corner of the room, 12-year-old Tommy sat doing his homework, waiting for his father's shift to end. It was the last day of school, and James had promised to take him fishing afterward. Mr. Williams, James called out to his supervisor, his voice tight with concern. "You might want to take a look at this," but before Williams could respond, a deep groan echoed through the building's steel skeleton. James's eyes met his son's across the room, and in that fraction of a second he made a decision that would echo through years to come. "Everybody out!" James's voice boomed across the factory floor. Workers looked up, startled by the urgency in his tone. "Now, move!" He sprinted toward Tommy, but halfway there he saw Sarah Collins, a young mother of 3, frozen in panic at her station. The rumbling grew louder. "Tommy, run." "Get outside!" James shouted, turning toward Sarah instead. Tommy stood rooted, watching his father rush in the opposite direction. "Now, son!" The command in his father's voice finally broke through Tommy's paralysis, and he bolted toward the exit with the stream of evacuating workers. The explosion came in waves. The first blast knocked Tommy off his feet just as he cleared the door. The second, more powerful detonation sent debris raining down around him. Through the chaos and screams, Tommy heard the distinctive sound of the factory's steel support beams giving way. When the dust settled, 13 lives had been lost. James Carter was found beside Sarah Collins, his body shielding her from the collapse. He had saved her life, along with countless others through his quick warning, but left his son alone in a world that was about to turn its back on a homeless orphan. As emergency vehicles' lights painted the smoke-filled sky in alternating red and blue, Tommy sat on the curb, his father's worn work jacket clutched to his chest. He didn't cry. He couldn't. The shock was too deep, the loss too absolute. He didn't know then that the true nightmare was just beginning, that the wealth and power of Evans Manufacturing, which had recently acquired the factory, would ensure the truth about the accident would stay buried along with his father. In his mansion across town, Matthew Evans, the elderly majority shareholder of Evans Manufacturing, read the preliminary accident report with detached interest, unaware that his signature on a cost-cutting measure months earlier had set in motion the events that would eventually lead him to a fateful encounter with a boy on a lonely road, a boy whose simple act of kindness would unravel everything he thought he knew about wealth, power, and the true cost of happiness. Join us on this emotional journey of love, sacrifice, and redemption. Every subscription brings more heartwarming stories to life. Subscribe now. The Evans manufacturing empire stood as a testament to generational wealth and influence in Kentucky. Founded in 1932 by Matthew Evans's father, George Evans, during the depths of the Great Depression, the company had grown from a small tool-making workshop into a sprawling industrial consortium that dominated the state's manufacturing landscape. The company's headquarters, a gleaming 40-story tower in downtown Louisville, cast a long shadow both literally and figuratively over the city. Inside its steel and glass walls, decisions were made that affected thousands of lives, though few of the executives making those decisions ever set foot in the factories they controlled. The boardroom on the top floor, with its mahogany table and leather chairs, had witnessed countless deals, mergers and acquisitions, each one expanding the Evans family's control over the region's industrial backbone. Matthew Evans, now in his late 70s, had inherited control of the empire 20 years ago. Under his leadership, The company's profits had soared, but so had its reputation for aggressive cost-cutting and union-busting. His business philosophy was simple efficiency above all else. Every quarter he demanded higher profits, and his managers learned that asking how was a career-ending question. The acquisition of Carter Manufacturing had been just another move on the corporate chessboard. The aging factory, with its loyal workforce and outdated safety protocols, represented both an opportunity and a liability. The opportunity lay in its contracts and market share, the liability in its aging infrastructure and stubborn adherence to what Matthew's advisors called excessive safety margins. In the months leading up to the accident, pressure mounted to increase productivity. Safety inspections were postponed, maintenance schedules were stretched, and warnings from floor supervisors were buried in bureaucratic red tape. The board celebrated each cost reduction as a victory, their spreadsheets showing healthy green upticks in profit margins. The system worked perfectly until it didn't. When the factory exploded, the Evans Empire's damage control machine whirred into action with practiced precision. Lawyers descended, papers were shredded, witnesses were silenced with generous settlements and ironclad endas. The official story, equipment failure due to operator error, was crafted before the smoke had cleared. The local media, dependent on Evans Manufacturing's advertising dollars, asked few questions. The regulatory investigation, led by officials who hoped to secure consulting jobs after retirement, found no corporate wrongdoing. Insurance paid out its claims, families received their settlements, and the incident was filed away in corporate archives. But power, no matter how absolute, has its price. For Matthew Evans, it was solitude. His mansion, larger than most hotels, echoed with emptiness. His wife had left years ago, tired of competing with the company for his attention. His children, raised in boarding schools and Ivy League universities, maintained purely financial relationships with their father. His friends, if they could be called that, were business associates who measured their loyalty in dollars and cents. The Evans Manufacturing empire had become a perfectly tuned machine for generating wealth, but somewhere along the way it had lost its soul. Its founder's original vision of creating jobs and building communities had been replaced by an insatiable hunger for profit. The company's motto, "Building America's Future carved in stone above the headquarters entrance," had become nothing more than a marketing slogan. In the weeks following the Carter Manufacturing disaster, Matthew's closest advisor, James Wilson, noted that the old man seemed distracted during board meetings. He would stare out his office window at the city below, lost in thought. But no one could have guessed that the empire's foundations were about to be shaken not by competitors or regulators or economic forces, but by a chance encounter with a homeless boy whose simple act of kindness would crack the carefully constructed facade of power and control that had taken 3 generations to build. For now, though, the Evans Manufacturing empire continued its relentless march forward, its machinery of wealth and influence grinding on, unaware that its greatest challenge would come not from without, but from within, from the awakening conscience of its own leader. Before the accident, Tommy Carter lived what many would consider an ordinary American life. The son of a skilled factory worker and a kindergarten teacher who had passed away from cancer 3 years earlier, Tommy excelled both in academics and athletics at Riverside Middle School. His father, James Carter, had rebuilt their life after his wife's death, creating a stable home filled with love, books, and the constant smell of his infamous Sunday morning pancakes. Their modest 2-bedroom house on Maple Street wasn't much by societal standards, but it was home. Tommy's room was plastered with science fair ribbons and engineering diagrams. He inherited his father's mechanical aptitude and spent weekends in their garage, taking apart and reassembling old radios and engines. James always said his son had golden hands, the natural ability to understand how things worked just by touching them. At school, Tommy was known as the kid who could fix anything. From broken calculators to jammed locker doors, his classmates sought his help, and he never refused. His teachers saw a bright future for him, especially Mrs. Anderson, his science teacher, who had already started talking about engineering scholarships, despite him being only in 7th grade. But the explosion that claimed his father's life didn't just steal his parent, it erased his entire world. The house on Maple Street, mortgaged to pay for his mother's medical bills, was foreclosed within months. His father's life insurance policy, which should have provided some security, was tied up in legal battles as Evans Manufacturing's lawyers argued about liability. Tommy's closest living relative, an uncle in Ohio, promised to take him in but disappeared after claiming the initial emergency assistance funds. The foster care system, overwhelmed and underfunded, lost his paperwork twice. Social workers, despite their best intentions, were juggling too many cases to give his situation the attention it deserved. Forced onto the streets, Tommy learned survival skills no child should need to know. He discovered which public restrooms stayed unlocked at night, which restaurants would give away leftover food at closing time, and which library security guards would let him stay inside during bad weather. His school backpack, once filled with books and homework, now carried his entire life: a change of clothes, his father's worn work jacket, a photo album, and a small toolkit. The local homeless shelter had strict rules about unaccompanied minors, so Tommy could only stay there on the coldest nights when the staff looked the other way. He learned to sleep lightly, to trust carefully, and to make himself invisible when necessary. Yet somehow, through it all, he managed to maintain his essential nature, his willingness to help others, his curiosity about how things worked, and his father's belief that every person deserved to be treated with dignity. He found work where he could helping at Thompson's garage until it closed, doing odd jobs for shopkeepers who didn't ask too many questions, and using his mechanical skills to repair anything from bicycles to appliances. Every dollar earned went into a small savings account he maintained at the local credit union, dreaming of the day he could afford a place of his own. The hardest part wasn't the physical discomfort or the constant hunger, it was the invisibility. Former neighbors crossed the street to avoid talking to him. His school friends, under pressure from their parents, stopped acknowledging him. Teachers who had once praised his potential now viewed him with pity or suspicion. He became a ghost in his own hometown, visible only when someone needed something fixed. Yet even in his darkest moments, Tommy held on to three things: his father's jacket, his toolkit, and his integrity. James Carter's last words to his son echoed in Tommy's mind, not as a reminder of loss, but as a call to action. His father had died saving others, and somewhere deep inside, Tommy believed that helping others was the way to honor his memory. He just never imagined that fixing a flat tire for a stranger would be the first step toward reclaiming everything he had lost and finding things he never knew he needed. Inside his 20,000-square-foot mansion on the outskirts of Louisville, Matthew Evans lived in splendid isolation. The sprawling estate, with its manicured gardens and state-of-the-art security system, was more museum than home. Priceless artworks adorned walls that never echoed with laughter, and crystal chandeliers illuminated rooms that rarely saw visitors. Every morning followed the same routine. His private chef, Maria, would prepare a breakfast he barely touched while he read financial reports. His personal assistant, Jennifer, would brief him on the day's meetings while he sipped imported coffee that had long since lost its taste. The garage housed 12 luxury cars, though he only ever drove the silver Mercedes, a habit formed when his wife had called it the least ostentatious of their vehicles. Sarah Evans had left him 15 years ago, tired of competing with spreadsheets and board meetings for his attention. Their divorce settlement made headlines in financial circles, not for its size, but for its clinical efficiency. Like everything else in Matthew's life, even the end of his marriage was handled like a business transaction. His children were strangers who wore his name. Michael, his eldest, managed a hedge fund in New York and called quarterly to discuss investment opportunities. Elizabeth, his daughter, lived in London with her third husband and communicated primarily through her assistant. Both had attended his last birthday dinner out of obligation, staying exactly 90 minutes before making polite excuses to leave. The only person who had stayed constant in Matthew's life was Wilson, his CFO and closest advisor. But even Wilson, after 30 years of loyalty, maintained a careful professional distance. He had witnessed too many others mistake Matthew's business acumen for friendship, only to be discarded when they no longer served a purpose. At 77, Matthew was aware of his legacy. The financial papers called him a titan of industry and visionary businessman. His charitable foundation donated millions to carefully selected causes, each donation strategically timed for maximum tax benefit and public relations impact. Yet in the quiet evenings, as he sat in his leather armchair nursing a glass of 30-year-old scotch, he sometimes caught his reflection in the window and wondered when his eyes had become so cold. The mansion's third floor housed a room he hadn't entered in years. Behind its locked door lay the remnants of a different life, photographs of a younger Matthew teaching Michael to ride a bike, Elizabeth's first attempt at an oil painting, Sarah's garden hat still hanging on a hook. He kept meaning to have the room cleared out but could never quite give the order. His own father, George Evans, had warned him about the price of success. "Money is a good servant but a cruel master," he used to say. But Matthew had been too ambitious to listen, too determined to expand the empire his father had built. Now, surrounded by the trappings of success, he felt the truth of those words in his bones. The irony wasn't lost on him that his wealth, which could buy almost anything, couldn't purchase what he increasingly realized: he lacked genuine human connection. His interactions were filtered through layers of employees, lawyers, and sycophants. Even his charitable works felt hollow, choreographed performances for tax benefits rather than genuine attempts to make a difference. Little did he know that fate was about to offer him a chance at redemption, not through his millions or his corporate power, but through a simple act of kindness from someone who had nothing to give but their time and humanity. The loneliness that had become his constant companion was about to be shattered by an encounter that would force him to confront not just who he had become, but who he still had the potential to be. The summer heat shimmered off the asphalt on Route 27, a lonely stretch of road that connected Louisville's wealthy suburbs to its industrial outskirts. Matthew Evans's silver Mercedes S-Class sat motionless on the shoulder, its right front tire completely flat. Inside the luxury vehicle, the aging millionaire tapped his manicured fingers against the leather steering wheel, his frustration growing with each failed attempt to reach roadside assistance. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. Here he was, one of Kentucky's wealthiest men, stranded on a road that ran past factories his company owned. His phone, a latest model device that cost more than some people made in a month, showed no signal. The car's advanced technology, which could practically drive itself, couldn't fix a simple flat tire. Matthew checked his Patek Philippe watch 3:15. He'd missed 2 board meetings already, and the thought of his carefully scheduled day unraveling made his jaw clench. In all his years of business, he'd prided himself on control. Now, a piece of rubber had rendered him helpless. He loosened his Italian silk tie and considered his options. The spare tire was in the trunk, along with what he assumed was the necessary equipment, but it had been decades since he'd changed a tire himself. His father would have known what to do. George Evans had believed every man should know how to work with his hands, but Matthew had spent his life ensuring he'd never have to. Through the tinted windows, he watched heat waves dance across the empty road. The factories in the distance stood like silent sentinels, their smokestacks reaching into the cloudless Kentucky sky. One of them had been Carter Manufacturing, now just an empty shell after the accident. Matthew pushed that thought away. He had enough problems right now. The sound of footsteps on gravel caught his attention. In his rearview mirror, he saw a figure approaching, a young boy, walking with purpose despite the oppressive heat. Matthew's first instinct was caution. His wealth had made him naturally suspicious of strangers. His finger hovered over the door lock button. But something about the boy's demeanor made him pause. The child moved with a quiet confidence that seemed beyond his years. His clothes were worn but clean, and he carried a backpack that looked too heavy for his frame. As the boy drew closer, Matthew could see his face clearly young, maybe 13 or 14, with intelligent eyes that had already seen too much. The boy stopped a respectful distance from the car and stood quietly, waiting to be acknowledged. It was a small gesture, but one that spoke of careful observation of social cues, something unusual in someone so young. Matthew found himself lowering the window, despite his initial reservations. "Got a flat tire?" said the boy asked, his voice steady and clear. There was no trace of the usual teenage awkwardness, just a simple question offered without presumption. The formality of the address, combined with the boy's direct gaze, stirred something in Matthew's memory. He'd seen eyes like that before in the mirror many years ago, when he was still hungry to prove himself to the world. "Yes," Matthew replied, surprising himself with how relieved he felt to simply acknowledge his predicament. "The roadside assistance service isn't responding, and I'm afraid I'm rather stuck." The boy nodded, as if this confirmed something he'd already surmised. He slipped his backpack off his shoulders and set it carefully on the gravel. "I can help with that," he said, not as a boast but as a simple statement of fact. "My father taught me how." There was something in the way he said father, a slight catch in his voice, almost imperceptible, that made Matthew pay closer attention. The boy's offer hung in the air between them, along with an unspoken question: would this wealthy man in his expensive car trust a young stranger's help? Neither of them knew it then, but this moment, this simple interaction on a hot Kentucky afternoon, would set in motion events that would change both their lives forever. The flat tire was just the beginning, fate's way of bringing together two souls who, despite their vast differences, were both running on empty. The summer sun beat down mercilessly as Tommy knelt beside the Mercedes, his practiced eyes assessing the situation. The flat tire was a clean puncture, nothing complicated. His hands moved with quiet efficiency as he located the jack points under the luxury vehicle, movements learned from countless hours at Thompson's garage. "Do you have a spare tire?" Sir Tommy asked, already knowing most luxury cars kept one hidden beneath the trunk liner. Matthew nodded, pressing the button to open the trunk. The equipment inside was pristine, never touched, a stark contrast to Tommy's worn toolkit that peeked out of his backpack. As he worked, Tommy maintained a respectful silence, broken only by the occasional necessary question or gentle instruction to Matthew. "Could you hand me that lug wrench, sir, or just need to raise it a bit more?" His movements were precise, almost choreographed, each motion serving a purpose. The skills his father had taught him flowed naturally, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought left off. Matthew stood watching, his initial unease giving way to fascination. The boy handled the expensive car with the same care and respect he might show a beloved old bicycle. There was no hesitation in his movements, no fear of the costly vehicle before him. The work itself seemed to bring him peace, as if solving this mechanical puzzle allowed him to forget, temporarily, whatever burdens he carried. Sweat beaded on Tommy's forehead as he worked, but he never complained about the heat. His father's voice echoed in his memory: "A job worth doing is worth doing right." No matter the weather, the memory brought a slight smile to his face, visible only to the hot Kentucky wind. The whole process took less than 20 minutes. Tommy secured the flat tire in the trunk and double-checked his work, making sure each lug nut was properly tightened. His father had taught him that shortcuts in work could mean danger on the road, and he took that lesson seriously. "All done," Sir Tommy announced, wiping his hands on his jeans as he stood up. "You might want to get that flat looked at. Sometimes they can be patched if the puncture's not too bad. Thompson's garage used to do good work, but since they closed." He trailed off, remembering another lost piece of his former life. Matthew reached for his wallet, pulling out several $100 bills. "Thank you, young man. This is for your trouble." He held out the money, expecting the boy to snatch it eagerly. Instead, Tommy took a step back, his expression unchanged but his eyes suddenly distant. "No, thank you, sir," he said quietly but firmly. "I don't need payment for helping someone. My father taught me that kindness isn't a transaction." The words came naturally, without pretense or pride, simply stating a truth he held dear. Matthew stood frozen, money still extended, confronted with something he hadn't experienced in decades: genuine, unconditional kindness. In his world, every action had a price, every favor came with expectations. But here was this boy, obviously in need, refusing compensation for his help. "At least let me give you something for your time," Matthew insisted, uncomfortable with being in someone's debt. Tommy shook his head, already shouldering his heavy backpack. "Your time is valuable too," Sir Tommy replied, "and you spent it waiting for me to help instead of calling someone else." Where even with that, he turned to leave, his stride purposeful despite the visible weight of his backpack. Matthew watched him go, the unused bills still in his hand. The boy's silhouette grew smaller against the industrial backdrop, his straight shoulders and steady pace at odds with his worn clothes and obvious poverty. Something about the interaction felt unfinished, incomplete. As Tommy disappeared around a bend in the road, Matthew looked down at his pristine shoes, now dusty from standing on the shoulder. The money in his hand, which had seemed like such an obvious solution moments ago, now felt somehow inadequate. For the first time in years, he found himself questioning the relationship between wealth and worth, between payment and value. Little did he know that this simple act of kindness would crack the foundation of everything he believed about human nature, success, and the true cost of a life spent measuring worth only in dollars and cents. That evening, Matthew Evans sat in his study, an untouched glass of 30-year-old scotch on the mahogany desk before him. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked away the minutes, but his mind remained fixed on the afternoon's encounter. His Italian leather shoes, still dusty from the roadside, sat accusingly by the door. The boy's refusal of money had shaken something loose in Matthew's carefully ordered world. In his experience, everyone had a price, it was just a matter of finding the right number. He'd built his empire on this principle, buying and selling not just companies but loyalty, silence, and even justice. Yet this child, who clearly had nothing, had refused what would have been a small fortune to someone in his position. Kindness isn't a transaction, the words echoed in his head, stirring memories he'd long suppressed. He remembered his own father, George Evans, standing in this very room 30 years ago, arguing against the first major layoff that Matthew had proposed. "These aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet," son, his father had said. "These are families, communities, lives." Matthew had dismissed it as sentimentality then, proud of his modern, efficient approach to business. He pulled up the Carter manufacturing accident report on his tablet, something he hadn't looked at since signing off on the final settlements. The clinical language couldn't mask the human cost: 13 deaths, dozens of injuries, countless lives upended. His signature was on the cost-cutting measures that had delayed crucial maintenance. Another signature had approved the legal strategy that buried the truth. The faces of the victims stared back at him from their personnel files. James Carter's photo caught his attention, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a slight smile, noted for his 20 years of service and perfect safety record. The file mentioned a son, but the details were redacted in the final report. Something about that nagged at Matthew's consciousness. Rising from his desk, he walked to the window. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, the same colors he'd seen while watching the boy walk away. From his hillside mansion, he could see the industrial district, where the Carter manufacturing building still stood empty, a monument to corporate negligence and human cost. For the first time in years, Matthew felt the weight of his decisions. Each signature, each cost-cutting measure, each legal maneuver had seemed logical, necessary for the business. But viewed through the lens of that boy's simple act of kindness, they took on a different character. What was the true cost of success? How many lives had been altered or destroyed by decisions he'd made without a second thought? The boy's worn clothes and heavy backpack suggested homelessness, yet he carried himself with dignity and showed genuine concern for others. Matthew thought about his own children, raised with every advantage, who couldn't be bothered to call except when they needed money. Somewhere along the way, he'd confused wealth with worth, profit with progress. His phone buzzed another message from Wilson about tomorrow's board meeting. The agenda included discussion of 3 more factory closures, part of their strategic optimization plan. The expected savings were substantial. 6 months ago, Matthew would have approved it without hesitation. Now, he found himself wondering about the human cost behind the numbers. Setting down his untouched scotch, Matthew moved to his computer. His fingers hesitated over the keyboard before typing in a search for recent news about homeless youth in Louisville. The results painted a picture he'd never bothered to see before: children living in shelters or on the streets, many displaced by the very economic forces he'd helped set in motion. As night fell over Louisville, Matthew Evans, titan of industry and master of the financial universe, sat alone in his study, confronting the possibility that he'd spent his life measuring success by the wrong metrics. The boy's simple act of kindness had cracked something open in him, a long dormant conscience beginning to stir. He didn't know it yet, but this awakening would lead him down a path that would challenge everything he'd built, everything he believed, and ultimately everything he thought he knew about himself. The investigation began quietly. Matthew instructed his most trusted private investigator, Frank Reynolds, to find information about the boy, providing a detailed description and the location of their encounter. What should have been a simple task proved surprisingly challenging. The boy seemed to exist in the shadows of Louisville, known to many but officially documented by few. The kid's like a ghost, Frank reported during their first meeting. No school records for the past year, no current address. But people know him. Thompson's garage, before it closed, he did odd jobs there. The library staff lets him stay late. Restaurant workers slip him leftovers. He's got a reputation for fixing things. Matthew sat in his office, overlooking the city skyline, as Frank laid out surveillance photos. The boy whose name they'd learned was Tommy appeared in various locations, sleeping in park corners, helping an elderly woman with her grocery cart, fixing a bicycle outside the public library. Each image showed the same worn backpack, the same determined expression. "I did find something interesting," Frank continued, sliding across a newspaper clipping from the previous year. The Carter manufacturing accident. One of the victims, James Carter, had a son, Tommy Carter, 13 years old at the time. After his father's death, he basically disappeared from the system. Matthew's hand froze over his coffee cup. Carter manufacturing, his company's acquisition, the accident he'd signed off on covering up. He remembered the file he'd reviewed just days ago, with its carefully redacted sections about the victims' families. The connection sent a chill through him. "Dig deeper," he instructed Frank. "I want everything. School records, family history, what happened after the accident. And Frank, keep this quiet. No one else needs to know." Over the next week, the story emerged piece by piece. Tommy had been an exceptional student, straight A's science fair winner, particularly gifted in engineering and mathematics. His mother had died of cancer 3 years before the accident, leaving James Carter as his only parent. They'd lived modestly but comfortably, active in their community, respected by neighbors. Then came the accident. The official report blamed operator error, but Frank's investigation uncovered troubling details. Maintenance requests ignored, safety protocols bypassed, cost-cutting measures implemented just weeks before the explosion. Each document bore Matthew's signature or his board's approval. The aftermath was equally disturbing. The Carter house, mortgaged to pay for Mrs. Carter's medical bills, was foreclosed. The insurance payout was tied up in legal battles. Tommy's uncle, entrusted with emergency assistance funds, disappeared with the money. The foster care system lost his paperwork twice. It was as if every safety net had been deliberately cut away. "There's more," Frank said during their final meeting. "Remember that legal strategy your team used? The one that delayed settlements to pressure families into accepting smaller payouts? Tommy's case was the test case. They knew a minor without representation would be easy to." He trailed off, seeing the expression on Matthew's face. Matthew dismissed Frank early that day. He spent hours reviewing the documents, tracking the decisions that had destroyed Tommy's life. Each memo, each policy change, each legal strategy had seemed reasonable at the time, just business decisions to protect the company's interests. Now they read like a methodical dismantling of a child's world. He found himself returning to the photo of James Carter, the father who had died saving others. The man's eyes seemed to stare back at him accusingly, and Tommy, his son, had shown kindness to the very man whose decisions had helped destroy his life. The irony was almost unbearable. Late that night, Matthew stood at his office window, watching the city lights below. Somewhere out there, Tommy Carter was probably searching for a safe place to sleep, carrying his world in a backpack, surviving on the edges of a society that had failed him at every turn. A society that Matthew had helped shape with his pursuit of profit above all else. The weight of this knowledge settled on him like a physical burden. For the first time, he truly understood what his father had meant about the human cost of business decisions. Each percentage point of profit increase, each successful cost reduction had real-world consequences. They weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet, they were lives altered, futures destroyed. Matthew reached for his phone to call Wilson, then stopped. This wasn't something he could delegate or solve with money alone. The boy who had helped him on the roadside had shown him a different way, one based on simple human kindness. Now, Matthew had to decide what to do with this knowledge, knowing that any attempt to help might be seen as too little, too late, or worse, another corporate attempt to buy silence and clear conscience. The investigation was complete, but Matthew's real journey was just beginning. The truth hit Matthew like a physical blow one rainy morning in his office. Wilson had arrived early with a stack of old documents, routine paperwork for the upcoming board meeting. Among them was a faded photograph that had slipped from a folder marked Carter Manufacturing Personnel Records Archived. The image showed a company picnic from 2 years before the accident. In it, a younger James Carter stood proudly next to a gleaming piece of machinery, his arm around a small boy who shared his eyes and smile, Tommy. But what caught Matthew's attention was the man standing next to them, his own son, Michael Evans, then the company's VP of Operations. Wilson Matthews' voice was barely a whisper. What was Michael doing at Carter Manufacturing that day? Wilson shifted uncomfortably, straightening his tie. He was overseeing the implementation of the new safety protocol, sir, the ones we revised after the acquisition. The memory rushed back with brutal clarity. Michael had argued against those revisions, calling them dangerous. Matthew had dismissed his concerns as naive, reminding him that business required tough decisions. 2 weeks later, Michael had resigned, cutting off all contact with the company and his father. But Matthew's hands trembled as he opened his computer, accessing files he hadn't looked at in years. Michael's resignation letter was brief but damning. "I cannot and will not be party to decisions that put profit above human life. The maintenance delays and safety shortcuts we've implemented are a disaster waiting to happen. When it does, the blood will be on our hands." The pieces fell into place with devastating precision. Michael hadn't just been overseeing safety protocols, he had been trying to protect the workers, including James Carter. He had seen the human faces behind the spreadsheet numbers. And when he failed, when his own father chose profits over safety, he had walked away from his inheritance and his family. Further digging revealed more connections. James Carter had been Michael's main ally within the factory, documenting safety concerns and helping compile reports. The two had become friends, sharing dinners and weekends. Michael had even attended Tommy's science fairs, encouraging the boy's engineering talents. A photo from one such fair showed Michael beaming beside Tommy, who proudly displayed a project on mechanical stress analysis, exactly the kind of analysis that might have prevented the factory accident. The ribbon on the project read "First Place." Sir Wilson interrupted his thoughts. "There's something else you should know." He placed another document on the desk, a trust fund set up, dated just days before the accident. Michael had attempted to establish an educational trust for Tommy Carter. The paperwork had been lost in the chaos following the explosion. Matthew sat back, the weight of these revelations crushing him. His son had seen what he couldn't or wouldn't. Michael had recognized the humanity in people like James Carter, had tried to protect them, had even planned for Tommy's future. And Matthew's blind pursuit of profit had destroyed all of it. The rain outside intensified, drumming against the office windows. Somewhere in the city, Tommy was probably seeking shelter, unaware that he had once been the focus of such care and concern from the Evans family. Unaware that Michael Evans had tried to prevent the accident that killed his father. Unaware that his chance encounter with Matthew was anything but chance. Wilson Matthews' voice was hoarse. "Find Michael, whatever it takes." "Sir, he's been very clear about not wanting contact." "This isn't about me," Matthew cut him off. "This is about making things right. For Tommy. For everyone we've hurt." Wilson nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. And the board meeting, they're expecting the new cost-cutting proposals. Matthew looked at the photo of Tommy and Michael at the science fair, at the proud smiles that spoke of hope and potential. "Cancel it. In fact, cancel everything. We have more important matters to address." As Wilson left, Matthew remained at his desk, surrounded by the evidence of his failures, not just as a businessman, but as a father and as a human being. The connection between his family and Tommy's wasn't just a coincidence, it was a reminder of the choices he had made and their devastating consequences. Outside his window, the city skyline was barely visible through the rain, including the empty shell of Carter Manufacturing in the distance. Matthew had spent years building an empire of wealth and influence, but his son had tried to build something far more valuable, a legacy of caring and responsibility. Now, faced with this truth, Matthew had to decide how to proceed. Simple charity wouldn't be enough. The damage he had done went far deeper than money could repair. He needed to find a way to honor both his son's wisdom and James Carter's sacrifice, and perhaps, in doing so, help give Tommy back some of what had been taken from him. The revelation of his son's connection to the Carters sent Matthew into a spiral of sleepless nights and tormented days. His mansion, once a symbol of success, now felt like a mausoleum built on others' suffering. Each room held reminders of the wealth he'd accumulated while families like the Carters had lost everything. In his study, Matthew pulled out old family albums he hadn't touched in years. Photos of Michael growing up showed a transformation he'd missed from an eager-to-please child to a young man with increasingly troubled eyes. The final photos, taken just before the Carter Manufacturing accident, showed Michael standing apart from his father at corporate events, his expression a mask of contained disapproval. "I raised him to be strong," Matthew muttered to his empty study, "to understand that business requires tough decisions, but Michael had learned a different kind of strength, the courage to stand up against wrong, even when it meant opposing his own father. The same kind of strength that had led James Carter to sacrifice his life saving others." The contrast between his son's moral clarity and his own ethical compromises haunted Matthew. He began reviewing every major decision he'd made over the past decades. Each acquisition, each layoff, each strategic restructuring had seemed logical at the time. Now he saw them through different eyes: Michael's eyes, Tommy's eyes, the eyes of every family his decisions had affected. During board meetings, Matthew found himself unable to focus. When executives presented new cost-cutting measures, he saw not efficiency improvements but more Tommies in the making, more children who might lose parents to corporate negligence, more families displaced by cold business logic. His carefully constructed worldview was crumbling. "Sir, are you feeling all right?" Wilson asked one afternoon, concerned by his boss's distraction. The board is waiting for your decision on the Henderson plant closure." Matthew stared at the proposal. 300 jobs would be lost, but the profit margins would improve by 2%. Once that would have been enough. Now he saw 300 James Carters, 300 Tommies. "No," he said quietly. "No more closures." The guilt wasn't just about Tommy or the Carter manufacturing disaster anymore. It was about a lifetime of choosing profits over people, of justifying human suffering with shareholder value. He thought of his own children, raised in luxury, but starved for genuine connection. He'd given them wealth, but denied them the chance to develop the kind of character Tommy showed every day. Late one night, standing in Michael's old room, Matthew found a journal hidden behind some books. Inside were detailed notes about Carter manufacturing maintenance requests, safety concerns, personal observations about the workers and their families. Michael had known them as people, not personnel numbers. The final entry, dated 3 days before the accident, read, "Dad won't listen. He can't see that what we're doing is wrong. I'm sorry, but I can't be part of this anymore." The weight of his son's words crushed Matthew's carefully maintained composure. He sank into Michael's old desk chair, tears flowing freely for the first time in decades. The empire he'd built, the wealth he'd accumulated, the power he wielded, all of it felt hollow compared to the simple integrity his son had shown. His phone buzzed another message about urgent business matters requiring his attention. Matthew ignored it. Instead, he pulled out a piece of paper and began to write, his hand shaking. "Dear Michael, I was wrong. About everything. I see that now, too late for so many, but maybe not too late to try to make some things right. I found Tommy Carter, the boy you tried to protect. He has your kind of strength." The letter remained unfinished on his desk. Words seemed inadequate to express the depth of his regret or the scope of what needed to be done. Simple apologies couldn't restore lost lives or rebuild shattered families, but money couldn't buy back integrity or wash away guilt. In the following days, Matthew moved through his world like a man awakening from a long illness. Every luxury around him seemed to mock the suffering he'd caused. The smooth leather of his car seats reminded him of Tommy's worn clothes. His chef-prepared meals made him think of the boy seeking leftovers from restaurants. The crisis of conscience affected every aspect of his life. He couldn't sign documents without questioning their human impact. He couldn't attend board meetings without hearing Michael's warnings echo in his mind. The corporate empire he'd spent his life building now felt like a monument to moral failure. But amid the guilt and internal conflict, a new resolve was forming. If his son had seen the right path years ago, perhaps it wasn't too late for Matthew to follow it now. The question was no longer about maintaining power or maximizing profits. It was about redemption, not just for himself, but for the company's soul. The first step was clear: he had to help Tommy. Not with a charitable gesture or legal settlement, but with the kind of genuine care and commitment his son had shown. It wouldn't erase the past, but it might help light the way toward a different future. Finding Tommy proved easier than approaching him. The boy had established predictable patterns: mornings at the public library studying from borrowed textbooks, afternoons doing odd repairs around the neighborhood, evenings searching for safe places to sleep. Matthew watched from a distance, each observation adding to his growing admiration and guilt. But one rainy Tuesday morning, Matthew entered the library carrying 2 cups of hot chocolate. He found Tommy in the engineering section, poring over an advanced mechanics textbook. The boy looked up as Matthew approached, recognition and wariness crossing his face simultaneously. "I thought you might be cold," Matthew said simply, offering one of the cups. Tommy hesitated, then accepted with a quiet thank you, so the formality remained, but something in his eyes softened slightly. They sat in silence for a while, Tommy returning to his book while Matthew pretended to read a newspaper. Finally, Matthew spoke. "You're studying mechanical stress analysis. That's advanced material for someone your age." Tommy's eyes lit up despite his obvious attempt to remain guarded. "It's fascinating, actually. the way forces interact, how materials respond to pressure. Understanding this might have stopped abruptly, pain flashing across his face. Might have prevented the factory accident, Matthew finished quietly. Tommy's head snapped up, his expression hardening. Yes, I know about Carter manufacturing. About your father. About everything. The boy's hands tightened around his cup. Why are you here, Mr. Evans? Did your lawyers find something else they need me to sign? The bitterness in his voice cut deep, but Matthew pressed on. No lawyers, no papers. I'm here because I was wrong. About everything. And because my son tried to prevent what happened, but I wouldn't listen. Over the next hour, Matthew shared the story of Michael's warnings, his resignation, and the trust fund he'd tried to establish for Tommy. The boy listened without comment, his face unreadable, but his keen intelligence missing nothing. Your son Tommy finally said he used to come to my science fairs. He explained things in a way that made sense. Dad liked him. The simple statement carried volumes of unspoken pain. Matthew nodded, fighting back tears. Michael saw what I couldn't, that business decisions affect real people, real families. He tried to protect yours. I failed both of you. Days turned into weeks. Matthew made no grand gestures, no attempts to solve everything with money. Instead, he showed up with hot chocolate on cold mornings, with lunch when he noticed Tommy skipping meals, with genuine interest in the boy's studies and ideas. They developed a routine. Morning study sessions at the library evolved into informal engineering lessons. Matthew brought books from his home library, resources he'd collected for Michael years ago. Tommy's natural talent flourished with proper guidance and encouragement. You remind me of him, Matthew said one day, watching Tommy solve a complex physics problem. Michael, I mean, same way of thinking, seeing connections others miss. Tommy was quiet for a moment. What happened to him? Your son. I don't know, Matthew admitted. He cut off contact after the accident. Can't blame him. He tried to prevent it. And I chose profit over people's lives. The honesty seemed to reach Tommy in a way that nothing else had. My dad, he said softly, he always said mistakes aren't final unless you refuse to fix them. Those words became a turning point in their relationship. Tommy began sharing more about his life, the daily challenges of homelessness, his strategies for staying safe, his dreams for the future. Matthew listened, really listened, learning more about courage and resilience from this boy than he had in decades of corporate leadership. One morning, arriving at the library, Matthew found Tommy working on a detailed drawing plans for improving safety systems in industrial machinery. The design was innovative, combining theoretical knowledge with practical understanding. This could save lives, Matthew said, studying the drawings. That's the point, Tommy replied simply. Everything I learn, everything I do, it has to matter. Has to help prevent what happened to my dad from happening to someone else. The trust building between them was fragile but real. Tommy never asked for help directly, and Matthew never offered charity. Instead, they built something more valuable, a relationship based on mutual respect and shared purpose. As weeks passed, library staff noticed changes in both of them. The wealthy businessman who arrived each morning seemed more human, less imposing. The homeless boy who haunted their shelves stood straighter, smiled more often. They made an odd pair, the aging millionaire and the young genius bent over books together, arguing theories, sharing ideas, and sometimes just sitting in comfortable silence. But shadows lurked at the edges of their growing connection. Matthew's investigations had stirred up questions about the accident that powerful people preferred to leave buried. And Tommy's brilliant mind was putting pieces together, drawing conclusions that could shake the foundations of the Evans corporate empire. Neither of them realized that their morning study sessions were being watched, photographed, reported. The trust they were building, as genuine as it was, would soon be tested in ways neither could anticipate. Forces were gathering, seeing their relationship not as redemption but as a threat to be eliminated. For now, though, they continued their daily meetings, each finding in the other something long missing from their lives. Tommy gained a mentor who saw and nurtured his potential. Matthew found a chance at redemption, and increasingly a reminder of the son he'd lost through his own blind ambition. One particularly good morning, after Tommy had masterfully explained a complex engineering concept, Matthew looked at him with pride mingled with sadness. "You know," he said, "your father would be proud of you." Tommy's eyes glistened, but his voice was steady. Sometimes I think he still is." The moment hung between them, full of unspoken understanding. Neither could know that it was one of their last peaceful mornings together, before the storm that was gathering would break over their heads, testing every bit of trust they had built. The first signs of trouble came during a quarterly board meeting at Evans Manufacturing. Wilson noticed board members exchanging significant glances as Matthew presented his new initiative for factory safety improvements. Richard Sterling, the most vocal of the directors, finally spoke up. "Matthew, there are concerns about your recent activities," Sterling said, sliding photographs across the polished boardroom table. They showed Matthew and Tommy at the library, sharing meals, studying together. "This relationship with the Carter boy, it poses significant risks to the company." Matthew stared at the surveillance photos, anger rising in his throat. "You've been having us followed." "We have a responsibility to protect the company's interests," another board member, Elizabeth Drake, interjected smoothly. "Your increasingly public association with the son of a disaster victim raises serious legal and PR concerns." The boardroom, with its mahogany panels and city views, suddenly felt suffocating. These were people Matthew had known for decades, played golf with, attended their children's weddings. Now they watched him with cold, calculating eyes. "The boy is brilliant," Matthew defended. "He has incredible potential." "The boy," Sterling cut in, "is a liability. His very existence reminds people of an incident we've spent considerable resources to put behind us. And now you're giving him access to company materials, technical knowledge." "I'm mentoring a gifted student," Matthew's voice was steel. "You're playing with fire," Drake warned. "What happens when he realizes who you are, what you did? Do you think his father's death can be erased with some hot chocolate and engineering books?" The words hit Matthew like physical blows, but he maintained his composure. "I'm not trying to erase anything. I'm trying to make things right." "Make things right?" Sterling laughed coldly. "You're the CEO of a billion-dollar corporation, not a social worker. Your responsibility is to this company, its shareholders, its employees." The opposition grew beyond the boardroom. Matthew's country club membership was quietly revoked. Invitations to social events dried up. His usual table at exclusive restaurants became mysteriously unavailable. The message was clear: the elite circle was closing ranks against him. Anonymous letters began arriving at his mansion, filled with thinly veiled threats about reconsidering his position and protecting his legacy. His phone calls were monitored, his emails scrutinized. The corporate machine he'd helped build was turning against its creator. Even Wilson, his loyal CFO, seemed torn. So he said one evening, "They're not entirely wrong about the risks. The legal implications alone." The legal implications of what Matthew demanded. Helping a child we wronged. Is that what we've become, Wilson? A company so focused on protecting itself that we've lost all humanity. The pressure increased. Board members began approaching major shareholders, expressing concerns about Matthew's mental state and decision-making capacity. Whispers of forced retirement circulated through corporate headquarters. One morning, Matthew found his private investigator, Frank Reynolds, waiting in his office. "They got to me," Sir Frank admitted, shame-faced. "Threatened to expose some past indiscretions. They want everything I found about the boy, about your son Michael, about the accident." Matthew sat heavily in his chair. "Did you give it to them?" "Not yet. But they're serious, Mr. Evans. These people, they'll destroy anyone who threatens their interests, including you." The irony wasn't lost on Matthew. He had helped create this culture, this ruthless pursuit of profit above all else. Now he was experiencing firsthand what it felt like to be on the other side. The opposition reached its peak during a private dinner at Sterling's mansion. The board's inner circle was present, along with key shareholders and legal advisors. The message was delivered with practiced concern. "Matthew, we value your years of leadership," Sterling began, "but your recent behavior suggests you need a break. A generous retirement package has been prepared. The board will handle the transition smoothly." "And if I refuse?" Drake smiled thinly. "Then we'll be forced to explore other options." The boy's presence in restricted areas of the library could be construed as corporate espionage. His use of company materials without authorization. Well, at his age, juvenile detention would be such a waste of potential. The threat to Tommy was the final straw. Matthew stood, his voice quiet but firm. "You're right about one thing. I did help build this company's culture. I encouraged this kind of ruthless thinking. But I was wrong. And if you think you can threaten a child to maintain your profit margins, you're about to learn just how formidable an opponent I can be." As he left Sterling's mansion that night, Matthew knew he had just declared war on some of the most powerful people in the state. The same tactics he had once employed to crush opposition would now be used against him. But looking at a photo of Tommy working on his safety designs, Matthew felt no regret. For the first time in his life, he was fighting for something more valuable than money or power. He was fighting for redemption, for justice, and for a boy who embodied everything his company should have stood for. The elite circle had made their move. Now it was his turn to show them that true power came from standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. The conspiracy unfolded with surgical precision. First came the anonymous tip to Child Protective Services about an elderly man spending suspicious amounts of time with a homeless minor. The social worker who arrived at the library was professional but firm, questioning Tommy for hours while Matthew was kept away. "It's for the child's protection," they explained, but Tommy saw through it immediately. "They're trying to separate us, aren't they?" he asked Matthew the next day, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Just like they separated everything else in my life." The library, their safe haven, became a battlefield. Suddenly there were new rules about unaccompanied minors, requirements for student IDs, restrictions on accessing technical materials. The elderly librarian, who had always turned a blind eye to Tommy's extended stays, was replaced by a strict new administrator. Then the media attacks began. A local newspaper ran a story questioning Matthew's mental fitness to lead Evans Manufacturing, citing erratic behavior and concerning associations. The article mentioned Tommy obliquely, painting him as a potential con artist preying on a wealthy, vulnerable senior. "Got a reporter following me now," Tommy informed Matthew one morning, his voice matter-of-fact. "She offered me money for dirt on you. Said they'd help me sue the company for my dad's death if I cooperated." Matthew's own security team reported increasing surveillance. Cars parked outside his mansion at night, photographs being taken, phones possibly tapped. His private files were mysteriously accessed, personal records accidentally leaked to the press. The board's strategy became clear: isolate them, discredit them, then destroy them. They were building a narrative, an unbalanced old man manipulated by a street-smart teenager, both posing risks to corporate stability. Wilson brought more troubling news. They're reopening the investigation into the factory accident, he reported. But not to find the truth, they're manufacturing evidence to implicate your son Michael in the safety failures. They'll claim he deliberately overlooked maintenance issues, then abandoned his post. The manipulation of Michael's reputation was a new low. They're trying to force him out of hiding, Matthew realized. They want to discredit everyone who knew the truth about that day. Tommy's life became increasingly difficult. Places that had once offered him shelter suddenly turned him away. The garage where he occasionally worked claimed they couldn't risk liability issues. Restaurants that had given him leftovers now claimed new health regulations. "They're trying to make me disappear," Tommy observed calmly, though Matthew noticed his clothes were getting looser, his face more drawn, just like they made the truth about the accident disappear. The conspiracy reached its most insidious level when Tommy's original case file from the accident mysteriously resurfaced. New evidence suggested his father had been drinking the day of the explosion, that his actions had contributed to the disaster. "That's a lie." Tommy's usual composure cracked when Matthew showed him the report. "My father never touched alcohol. He said it dulled the senses, made machinery dangerous. They're trying to destroy his memory." Matthew watched the boy struggle to maintain control, seeing in him the same determination he'd seen in Michael. Both had faced impossible odds with unwavering integrity. Both had refused to bend to corporate pressure. The final strike came through legal channels. A court order was issued restricting Matthew's access to company resources, citing concerns about corporate espionage. Another motion suggested Tommy be placed in state custody for his own protection. "They're not just trying to stop us," Matthew realized, studying the legal documents. "They're trying to erase any possibility of the truth coming out. They want to bury it so deep no one will ever find it." But the conspirators had made a crucial mistake. In their eagerness to separate Matthew and Tommy, they had actually pushed them closer together. Each new attack only strengthened their resolve. Tommy began documenting everything: surveillance cars, suspicious encounters, sudden policy changes. His engineer's mind recognized patterns, collected evidence, built a case. Matthew, meanwhile, used his decades of business experience to read between the lines, anticipate moves, prepare countermeasures. They met in new locations each day, never staying too long in one place. Tommy taught Matthew about surviving on the streets, how to spot followers, how to disappear in a crowd. Matthew taught Tommy about corporate tactics, how to recognize manipulation, how to protect himself legally. "They think we're weak because we care," Tommy said one evening, as they shared a simple meal in a quiet diner. "But caring about something bigger than yourself, that's real strength, isn't it?" Matthew looked at the boy who had taught him more about courage than all his years in business. "Yes," he agreed, "that's exactly what it is." The conspiracy against them was powerful, well-funded, and ruthless, but it had underestimated the strength of the bond between a grieving boy and a repentant man. It had failed to understand that their connection wasn't about money or power or even revenge. It was about redemption, justice, and the simple human need to make things right. As the pressure mounted and the threats intensified, Matthew and Tommy prepared for the inevitable confrontation. They knew the conspiracy would eventually show its hand, make its decisive move. When it did, they would be ready. What their opponents didn't realize was that every attempt to break them had only made them stronger. Every attack had confirmed the righteousness of their cause. And when the final battle came, they would face it together: the boy who had never lost his humanity and the man who had finally rediscovered his. The night they took Tommy was unseasonably cold for Kentucky. Matthew had just finished their evening meeting at the diner, watching the boy disappear into the shadows as he always did, refusing offers of safer accommodation. An hour later, his phone rang, a photo message showing Tommy unconscious in what looked like a warehouse, followed by coordinates and a simple message: "Come alone." Matthew recognized the location immediately: the abandoned Carter manufacturing building. The symbolism was deliberate, a cruel reminder of where everything had started. His hands shook as he called Wilson. "They've taken him." Matthew's voice was raw. "Get me everything we have on the old factory layout. And Wilson, if I don't contact you by morning, release everything. All the files, all the evidence, everything." The factory loomed against the night sky, its empty windows like dead eyes. Security cameras that should have been dormant tracked Matthew's approach, their red lights blinking in the darkness. The main entrance was unlocked. Another message. They wanted him inside. His footsteps echoed through the abandoned production floor, past rusted machinery and fallen beams. The explosion damage had never been repaired, leaving the building a skeletal monument to corporate greed. Matthew's flashlight beam caught fragments of the past a fallen safety poster, a time clock frozen at 9:47, the moment everything had changed. "Up here, Mr. Evans," Sterling's voice carried from the foreman's office overlooking the factory floor. "I believe we have something to discuss." Tommy sat in a chair, conscious but restrained. A bruise was forming on his cheekbone, but his eyes were clear and defiant. 2 security guards flanked him, while Sterling and Drake stood by the office's broken window. "Quite a view, isn't it?" Sterling gestured to the factory floor below. "This is where it happened, you know, where James Carter made his heroic sacrifice. Now his son will have a chance to make a different kind of sacrifice." "Let him go." Matthew's voice was deadly calm. "He's just a boy." "A boy who knows too much," Drake interjected. "A boy who's been asking dangerous questions, designing safety improvements that highlight past oversights. Combined with your recent erratic behavior, it's become a liability we can no longer ignore." Tommy struggled against his restraints. "You can't hide the truth forever. People deserve to know what really happened here." Sterling laughed coldly. "Truth? The truth is whatever we say it is. Just ask your father. Oh wait, you can't. He died a hero or a drunk or a negligent worker. We haven't decided which version plays better with the press." "What do you want?" Matthew asked, though he already knew. "Your immediate resignation," Drake stated. "Full divestment of your shares. A public statement about stepping down due to health concerns. And most importantly, your silence and his." "And if we refuse?" Sterling's smile was predatory. "Then we'll have a tragic accident right here where it all began. A troubled homeless youth breaking into an abandoned building. Such a shame. And you, Mr. Evans, will face questions about your relationship with said youth. Questions that could end with you in prison." Matthew looked at Tommy, seeing not fear but determination in the boy's eyes. He remembered another set of eyes, Michael's, looking at him with the same unwavering integrity before walking away. "You're right about one thing," Matthew said quietly. "This is where it all began, where I lost my way, where I chose profit over people. But it's also where it ends." He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. "Wilson, are you getting this?" Sterling's smile faltered. "What?" "Did you really think I'd come alone?" Matthew's voice gained strength. "That I hadn't learned anything from the boy you're threatening? Everything you've just said has been streaming live to my lawyers, the FBI, and every major news outlet in the state." The security guards shifted uncomfortably. Drake's face went pale. "You see," Matthew continued, "Tommy taught me something important. Sometimes the best safety mechanism is simple transparency. No complex systems, no corporate manipulation. Just the truth, broadcast for everyone to see." "You're bluffing," Sterling snarled, but uncertainty crept into his voice. "Am I?" Matthew held up his phone, showing the live stream counter. "Thousands of people are watching right now, including, I believe, my son Michael." "Hello, son. I'm sorry it took me so long to do the right thing." The sound of sirens grew in the distance. Tommy's lips curved into a small, proud smile. Sterling lunged for Matthew's phone, but decades of corporate comfort had left him slow. Tommy, seizing his moment, kicked out with both feet, sending his chair toppling backward into the guards. The momentary chaos was all Matthew needed to step between the boy and their attackers. "It's over," Matthew said as police lights began flashing through the broken windows. "The truth is out. Just like it should have been 3 years ago." The next few minutes were a blur of activity: police storming the building, arrests being made, Tommy being cut free. But what Matthew remembered most was the moment Tommy reached him, bruised but unbowed. "You did it," the boy said simply. "You chose differently this time." Matthew put a hand on Tommy's shoulder, feeling the strength that had been there all along. "No," he replied. "We did it. You showed me how." As they walked out of the factory together, past the ghosts of past decisions and toward a future neither of them could have imagined, Matthew realized that sometimes the greatest acts of courage come not from grand gestures, but from simple choices to do what's right, no matter the cost. In the aftermath of Tommy's kidnapping, Matthew's world moved at a dizzying pace. The live stream from the factory had gone viral, triggering a cascade of events that threatened to tear Evans' manufacturing apart. But Matthew wasn't focused on the company anymore. His entire being was consumed with ensuring Tommy's safety and bringing the truth to light. The first sacrifice came when the board called an emergency meeting. Matthew walked into the boardroom knowing it would be his last time there. The directors sat in stony silence as he laid out everything: the accident cover-up, the falsified reports, the systematic destruction of evidence. He implicated himself in every decision, taking full responsibility. "I'm not just stepping down," he announced. "I'm turning state's evidence. Everything I know, every document I've signed, every decision I've approved, it's all going to the authorities." The boardroom erupted in chaos. Threats of lawsuits, promises of destruction, attempts at negotiation. Matthew heard them all with a strange sense of detachment. His entire fortune would likely be decimated by legal fees and settlements. The empire he'd spent his life building would crumble, and for the first time he felt truly free. But the personal sacrifices were just beginning. Old friends turned their backs. Country club memberships were revoked. Social invitations dried up. Matthew Evans, once the toast of Louisville society, became a pariah overnight. His mansion, once filled with sycophants and social climbers, stood empty except for essential staff. Through it all, Tommy stayed by his side, offering a different kind of wealth: honest friendship, unwavering loyalty, and the kind of wisdom that comes only from facing life's hardest truths early. The boy's presence reminded Matthew daily that some things were worth more than money or social status. The threats escalated. Matthew's car brakes were tampered with. A suspicious fire broke out in his garage. Anonymous letters detailed ways his life could be destroyed, but each threat only strengthened his resolve. He moved Tommy into the mansion, converting the library into a secure living space, complete with advanced security systems. "You don't have to do this," Tommy said one evening, watching Matthew review another stack of legal documents. "They're destroying everything you built." Matthew looked up, seeing concern in the boy's eyes. "I built the wrong things, Tommy. It's time to build something better." The greatest test came when Wilson discovered a plot to frame Tommy for corporate espionage. The evidence had been carefully fabricated security footage doctored to show the boy stealing company documents, fake emails suggesting he was selling secrets to competitors. Matthew knew what he had to do. In a midnight meeting with his lawyers, he signed over his entire personal fortune to a trust, specifically structured to protect it from corporate claims. The trust had one beneficiary: Tommy Carter. "This money can't bring back your father," Matthew told Tommy when he explained what he'd done. "But it can help build the kind of world he died trying to protect. Use it for education, for improving factory safety, for helping others who've been hurt by corporate greed." Tommy's eyes filled with tears the first time Matthew had seen him cry. "But what about you? They'll take everything else." "They can take my money, my reputation, my social standing, but they can't take what matters most: the chance to finally do what's right." The sacrifice wasn't just financial. Matthew knew he was likely facing criminal charges himself. His role in the cover-up, despite his later attempts to expose it, couldn't be ignored. He might well end up in prison. But even as his world crumbled around him, Matthew found himself standing straighter, sleeping better, feeling more alive than he had in years. Each sacrifice stripped away another layer of the false self he'd built, revealing the man he should have been all along. The rescue attempt had succeeded, but not in the way anyone might have expected. Yes, Tommy had been physically saved from his kidnappers, but the deeper rescue was spiritual: Matthew's soul saving itself through sacrifice, truth, and redemption. One morning, as they sat in the mansion's kitchen sharing a simple breakfast, Tommy looked at Matthew thoughtfully. You know what my dad used to say about sacrifice? Matthew shook his head. He said, true sacrifice isn't giving up something you love for something you love more. It's giving up something you love for what's right, even if it hurts. Matthew reached across the table, squeezing Tommy's shoulder. Your father was a wise man. So is his son's friend, Tommy replied quietly. The words hung in the air between them, a testament to the unexpected bonds that can form when people choose truth over comfort, right over easy, sacrifice over self-preservation. Whatever came next, legal battles, public scrutiny, possible imprisonment, Matthew knew he'd finally made choices he could be proud of. The empire he'd spent his life building was falling, but something stronger was rising from its ruins, a legacy of truth, justice, and the kind of courage that comes only from being willing to sacrifice everything for what's right. The final confrontation took place in the federal courthouse, a grand limestone building that had stood witness to Louisville's most significant legal battles. Matthew and Tommy arrived early, climbing the worn steps together past a gauntlet of reporters and photographers. Inside the packed courtroom, Sterling, Drake, and the other board members sat in expensive suits, their confidence still intact, despite the charges against them. Their legal team, a dozen strong, filled the defense tables with laptops and documents. The air crackled with tension as Judge Harrison entered, her expression grave. The prosecution's opening statement laid bare 3 years of corporate malfeasance. Evidence mounted falsified safety reports, buried maintenance requests, intimidation of witnesses. Each revelation landed like a physical blow, but the real shock came from the witnesses. Former employees stepped forward, their testimonies breaking years of enforced silence. Maintenance workers described rejected repair requests. Safety inspectors detailed how their reports were altered. Families of victims spoke about pressure to accept settlements and sign non-disclosure agreements. Sterling's composure cracked when Michael Evans entered the courtroom. Matthew's son had finally emerged from hiding, carrying boxes of original documents he'd secretly preserved before the accident. His testimony was devastating. I warned them, Michael stated, his voice steady. I showed them exactly how the cost-cutting measures would compromise safety. I put it in writing, filed official protests. When they ignored me, I resigned, but I kept copies of everything. Sterling's lawyer leaped up. Objection. These documents weren't part of discovery. Because your clients destroyed the originals, Michael responded before the judge could rule. Just like they tried to destroy the truth about what happened that day. The courtroom fell silent as security camera footage from the day of the accident played. The timestamps had been restored, showing the sequence of events that led to the explosion. James Carter's final moments appeared on screen, not a drunk or negligent worker, but a hero who saved dozens of lives. Tommy sat rigid beside Matthew, watching his father's last acts of courage. Matthew gripped the boy's shoulder, feeling him tremble but refused to look away. Drake broke first. During cross-examination, she crumbled, admitting to orchestrating the cover-up. We had protocols, she sobbed, cost-benefit analyses for everything. Even human lives had a price tag. That's how the system worked. Sterling tried to maintain control, but his testimony unraveled under prosecution questioning. His attempts to blame others, to justify decisions, to explain away evidence grew increasingly desperate. When confronted with proof of Tommy's kidnapping, he finally snapped. You don't understand what it takes, he shouted at the court. You think business runs on good intentions? On kindness? Someone has to make the hard decisions. Someone has to keep the machine running. No, Matthew stood, addressing the court. The machine stops here. I helped build it. I believed in it. I watched it destroy lives, including my own son's trust and Tommy's family. Today we break it apart. The judge's ruling was unequivocal. Sterling, Drake, and 6 other executives were found guilty on multiple counts. The sentences were severe prison terms, massive fines, lifetime bans from corporate leadership positions. Evans Manufacturing would be placed under independent oversight, its entire safety and compliance systems rebuilt from the ground up. But the most powerful moment came after the verdict. As the defendants were led away, Tommy approached Sterling. The former executive flinched, expecting accusation or triumph. Instead, Tommy spoke quietly. "My father believed everyone deserves a chance to do better," he said. "Even you. Remember that in prison." The media called it the biggest corporate corruption case in Kentucky history. Headlines praised the exposure of corporate greed, the triumph of truth over power. But for Matthew, watching Tommy walk out of the courthouse with head high, the victory was more personal. "What happens now?" Tommy asked, as they descended the courthouse steps together. Matthew looked at his son Michael, who had joined them, then back at Tommy. "Now we rebuild. Not just the company, everything. We do it right this time. Together." The confrontation had exposed more than corporate corruption. It had revealed the possibility of redemption. In facing the dark heart of the system he'd helped create, Matthew had found his way back to the light. In standing up to power, Tommy had honored his father's memory and found a new kind of family. As they walked away from the courthouse, reporters called out questions about the future of Evans Manufacturing. But Matthew, Tommy, and Michael paid no attention. They had confronted the corrupt heart of corporate power and emerged victorious, not just legally, but morally. The real work of healing, rebuilding, and creating something better was just beginning. The machine had been broken, but from its ruins would rise something new, a legacy of integrity, justice, and the courage to stand up for what's right, no matter the cost. The confrontation was over, but its echoes would ripple through Louisville's corporate world for years to come, a reminder that even the most entrenched systems can be changed when people choose truth over power, humanity over profit. The victory in court should have marked the end of their struggles, but fate had other plans. Just as Matthew, Tommy, and Michael began their work of rebuilding Evans Manufacturing, betrayal struck from an unexpected quarter. Wilson, Matthew's trusted CFO of 30 years, had been quietly working against them. While presenting a facade of loyalty during the trial, he had been methodically gathering allies among the remaining board members and major shareholders. His pitch was simple but effective. Matthew's reformation threatened the company's profits, and change needed to be stopped before it destroyed shareholder value. The betrayal revealed itself during a crucial board meeting about implementing new safety protocols. Wilson stood up, straightening his tie with familiar precision, and presented a devastating report. He had documented every interaction between Matthew and Tommy, twisting their relationship into something sinister. Private conversations became conspiracy, mentorship became manipulation, genuine care became calculated PR. "We must face facts," Wilson announced to the stunned boardroom. "Mr. Evans's judgment has been compromised by guilt and emotional attachment to the Carter boy. His proposed changes would bankrupt the company within 18 months. Tommy, who had been invited to present his safety improvement designs, sat frozen as Wilson systematically dismantled their plans. The CFO used Tommy's own detailed notes against them, presenting them as evidence of industrial espionage orchestrated by Matthew to justify his irrational reforms. "Consider the timing," Wilson continued smoothly. "Mr. Evans encounters a homeless boy, coincidentally the son of a disaster victim, and suddenly develops a conscience. This isn't redemption, it's manipulation by a troubled youth taking advantage of an elderly man's guilt." Michael stood to defend his father, but Wilson was prepared. He projected emails onto the screen, private communications between Michael and environmental groups, plans to transform Evans Manufacturing into a worker-owned cooperative, strategies for dismantling the corporate structure from within. "The Evans men have been compromised," Wilson concluded. "Their wealth and privilege have turned to guilt, making them dangerous to this company's survival. We need to act decisively." The betrayal cut deeper because Wilson had been more than an employee. He had been family friend, confidant, witness to both triumph and tragedy. He had attended Michael's graduation, sent flowers when Matthew's wife left, kept secrets and offered counsel through decades of corporate battles. "Why?" Matthew asked simply. after the board voted to suspend him pending investigation. Wilson's face softened momentarily. "Because you taught me too well, old friend. The company survives. Everything else is secondary." Security escorts appeared to remove them from the building. As they walked out of corporate headquarters, Tommy noticed Matthew's hands trembling slightly, not from anger or fear, but from the deep pain of betrayal. The media storm was immediate and vicious. Wilson's carefully crafted narrative painted Matthew as an unstable elderly man manipulated by a cunning street youth and his estranged son. Years of corporate credibility gave weight to his words. Former allies distanced themselves, partners withdrew, and the reforms they had fought so hard to implement began to crumble. That evening, in Matthew's study, the three of them sat in heavy silence. The room still held ghosts of countless meetings with Wilson, strategies planned, victories celebrated. Now those memories were tainted. "He used everything I taught him," Matthew said quietly. "Every lesson about protecting the company, about strategic thinking, about identifying and eliminating threats. I created the perfect corporate soldier, and now he's turned those weapons against us." Tommy, who had been studying the financial reports Wilson had presented, looked up. He made one mistake, though. He assumed we're fighting to save the company. We're fighting for something bigger. Michael nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. The company was always just a means to an end. The real goal is changing the system itself. And systems, Tommy added, his young voice carrying wisdom beyond his years, change from the outside more easily than from within. But Matthew looked at his son and the boy who had become like a second son to him. In their eyes he saw not defeat but determination. Wilson had betrayed them, but in doing so he had unknowingly liberated them from the constraints of working within the system. "So we start over," Matthew said, his voice growing stronger. "Not with corporate reforms, but with something entirely new." The betrayal had wounded them, but it had also shown them their true path forward. Sometimes paradise must be lost before it can be rebuilt into something better. Outside, the sun set on another Louisville evening, casting long shadows through the study windows. Within those shadows, 3 generations of reformers began planning their next move, their bond strengthened by the very betrayal that had sought to break them. The morning after Wilson's betrayal, Tommy vanished. His room in Matthew's mansion was empty, the bed neatly made, his few possessions gone. Only his notebook remained, open to a page with a hastily scrawled note: "I won't let them use me to destroy what you built. Thank you for everything." Matthew's heart sank as he read the words. Tommy had taken Wilson's accusations to heart, believing that his presence was damaging Matthew and Michael's chances of reclaiming the company. The boy's inherent nobility had led him to make the ultimate sacrifice, removing himself from the equation. Security footage showed Tommy leaving at 3 a.m., his father's worn work jacket pulled tight against the cold, his backpack slung over his shoulder. The cameras tracked him to the property's edge before losing sight. He had slipped away like a shadow, using the street survival skills that had kept him alive before. "He's trying to protect us," Michael said, watching the footage for the 3rd time. "Just like his father protected others during the accident. The Carter men and their damn nobility." The city seemed to swallow Tommy whole. His usual haunts, the library, Thompson's old garage, the diner where they'd shared meals, yielded no sign of him. The homeless community, usually willing to help Matthew since he'd begun working with Tommy, reported no sightings. Days turned into weeks. Matthew and Michael split their time between searching for Tommy and fighting Wilson's corporate takeover. The boy's absence left a palpable void in their lives. The mansion's library, where he'd spent countless hours studying engineering texts, felt eerily quiet. His half-finished safety designs lay untouched on the desk, a testament to potential interrupted. The local news, still feeding on Wilson's narrative, spun Tommy's disappearance as proof of guilt. "Homeless youth flees amid corporate scandal," read one headline. Another suggested he'd been paid to disappear, taking corporate secrets with him. Each story twisted the knife deeper. Matthew found himself walking the city streets at night, retracing routes Tommy might have taken. He saw the city differently now, through the eyes of a homeless child. Every alley could be a shelter, every closed business a potential hiding place. The urban landscape became a maze of survival possibilities. One rainy evening, Matthew discovered Tommy's old sleeping spot behind the library, a sheltered alcove hidden from street view. Someone had recently been there, cardboard laid carefully to protect from the damp ground, a candy wrapper still fresh. But by the time Matthew returned with supplies and warm food, the spot was empty. Michael organized search parties, coordinating with homeless outreach programs and youth shelters. They distributed photos, offered rewards, set up a hotline. The response was overwhelming, dozens of reported sightings, each leading nowhere. Tommy had learned too well how to become invisible. The boy's absence affected them in unexpected ways. Matthew found himself hoarding food in his office, unable to eat a meal without thinking of Tommy going hungry. Michael kept the library lights on all night, hoping their glow might guide him home. Both men jumped at every phone call, every unexpected noise. Signs of Tommy's influence remained everywhere. His mathematical calculations still covered whiteboards in the study. His careful notes on factory safety improvements filled folders in Matthew's office. A half-drunk hot chocolate, his favorite, had hardened in its cup on the library desk, neither man willing to clean it away. The worst moments came when Matthew visited Carter Manufacturing's memorial wall. Tommy's father's name stood etched in stone alongside the other victims. Now father and son were both gone, their absences linked by the same corporate machinery that had destroyed so many lives. "He thinks he's protecting us," Matthew said one evening, staring out at the city lights. "But he doesn't understand. Without him, none of this means anything." Michael placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "We'll find him." But both men felt the weight of uncertainty. Tommy was smart, resourceful, and determined. If he didn't want to be found, if he truly believed his absence was necessary for their success, he could disappear completely. As another night fell over Louisville, Matthew stood in Tommy's empty room. The boy's notebook still lay open, its pages filled with brilliant ideas and careful calculations. In the margins, Tommy had doodled small machines, each designed to make factories safer, to protect others from his father's fate. The room felt like a memorial to interrupted potential, to nobility misplaced, to sacrifice taken too far. Somewhere in the city, a boy who had already lost too much had chosen to lose everything again, believing it was the right thing to do. And two men who had finally learned to value things beyond wealth and power found themselves facing their greatest fear, that their redemption might come at the cost of losing the very person who had made it possible. Matthew's desperate search for Tommy consumed every waking moment. His wealth, once spent on luxury and corporate power, now funded an extensive network of searchers. Private investigators worked around the clock. Homeless shelters received anonymous donations with requests to watch for the boy, and security cameras across Louisville were monitored continuously. The corporate battle with Wilson seemed distant and unimportant compared to finding Tommy. Matthew delegated most of the legal fight to his attorneys, focusing instead on following even the faintest leads. He visited every place Tommy had ever mentioned, interviewed anyone who might have seen him, and spent sleepless nights driving through the city's darkest corners. One promising lead came from a street vendor who recognized Tommy's photo. "Yeah, saw him couple days ago," the man said, counting the generous reward money. "Kid was helping fix a broken generator at the homeless camp under Jefferson Bridge. Smart boy, got it running in minutes. But he was gone before anyone could thank him." The Jefferson Bridge camp yielded more clues. Residents spoke of a young mechanic who appeared occasionally, fixed what needed fixing, and disappeared without accepting payment. He never stayed long, never shared personal details, but left things working better than he found them. It was Tommy's signature, helping others while staying invisible. Michael discovered another pattern in the sightings. Tommy seemed to be following his father's old route to work, visiting places James Carter had frequented. The diner where he'd eaten breakfast, the park where he'd taught Tommy to ride a bike, the community center where he'd volunteered Tommy's ghost, touched each location briefly before vanishing again. He's not just running, Michael realized, he's grieving, finally allowing himself to feel the loss he's carried since the accident. The search took an emotional toll on Matthew. He lost weight, slept poorly, aged visibly under the stress. The boy's absence felt like a physical pain, a constant reminder of how many times he'd failed to protect those who needed him most. One night, exhausted from another fruitless search, Matthew found himself at the accident site. The demolished factory stood silent under the stars, its ruins a monument to corporate greed and human cost. As he stood there, a security guard approached. "I've been seeing a kid around here lately," the guard offered without prompting. "Real quiet, comes at night, sits by the memorial wall, sometimes talks to his dad's name. Never causes trouble, so I let him be." Matthew's heart leaped. When did you last see him?" "Most nights around midnight, just sits there till dawn, then disappears into the shadows. Reminds me of them cats at the cemetery keeping vigil, you know." That night, Matthew waited in his car near the memorial wall. Hours passed. The city slept. Then, just before midnight, a familiar figure emerged from the darkness. Tommy, thinner but unmistakable, approached his father's name on the wall. Matthew wanted to rush forward, to grab the boy and never let go, but something held him back. Tommy was speaking to the wall, his words carrying faintly on the night air. "I'm trying, Dad. Trying to do what's right, like you did. But it's hard knowing my presence might ruin their chances of fixing things. Mr. Evans and Michael, they're good men. They want to change things, make factories safer, prevent other families from being destroyed. I can't be the reason they fail." The words broke Matthew's heart. He stepped forward, intentionally making noise to avoid startling the boy. Tommy turned, his face showing no surprise at the intrusion. "You heard?" he asked quietly. Matthew nodded. "You're wrong, you know. About ruining our chances. Without you, there's nothing worth fighting for." Tommy's composure cracked slightly. "Wilson used me to discredit you. The media, the board, they all believe his lies." "Let them," Matthew said firmly. "Some things matter more than corporate reputation. You taught me that, remember?" The boy who had survived so much, who had maintained his dignity through countless hardships, finally allowed tears to fall. Matthew stepped forward, opening his arms, and Tommy moved into them like a ship finding harbor. "Come home," Matthew whispered. "We'll fight them together the right way, the honest way. No more running, no more hiding." Over Tommy's shoulder, James Carter's name seemed to gleam on the memorial wall, as if offering approval. A father's sacrifice had set these events in motion. A son's disappearance had revealed what truly mattered. As they walked to the car together, Tommy looked back one last time at his father's name. "I was trying to be noble, like him." "You are," Matthew assured him. "But your father's nobility wasn't just in his sacrifice, it was in how he lived, how he cared for others, how he fought for what was right. That's the legacy you need to carry forward." The desperate search was over, but its lessons would remain. Sometimes the most precious things couldn't be protected by running away, but by standing together, facing whatever came with united strength and shared purpose. Dawn was breaking as they drove home, painting Louisville's skyline in shades of hope. The corporate battle still loomed, Wilson's betrayal still stung, but none of it seemed insurmountable anymore. They had found something stronger than wealth, more powerful than corporate influence. They had found family. The truth emerged through a series of old photographs Michael found while cleaning out his father's study. Hidden in a dusty album was an image that stopped him cold: his mother, Sarah Evans, standing in a hospital hallway with a woman who looked strikingly familiar. "Dad," Michael called, his voice shaking. You need to see this." Matthew and Tommy, who had been reviewing safety proposals in the library, came to examine the photograph. The resemblance was undeniable. The woman standing beside Sarah was Tommy's mother, Amy Carter, in her nursing uniform. "She was your mother's nurse," Matthew whispered, memory flooding back. "During the cancer treatments, they became close friends. How could I have forgotten?" More photographs surfaced: Sarah and Amy at hospital charity events, family picnics, holiday gatherings. In several, a young Michael played with a toddler Tommy. Their families had been intertwined long before the factory accident, before corporate ambition had torn everything apart. "There's more," Michael said, pulling out his mother's old diary. The entries told a story none of them had known. Sarah and Amy had made a pact. During Sarah's recovery, they would look out for each other's children. When Amy later fell ill herself, Sarah had tried to honor that promise, but Matthew's obsession with the company had driven her away. "Your mother died 3 months before Sarah left me," Matthew realized, looking at Tommy. "She wanted us to help your family, but I was too focused on a corporate merger. That's why she couldn't stay. I'd broken the last promise she asked me to keep." Tommy sat quietly, absorbing this revelation. All those years on the streets, surviving alone, there had been a connection, a promised protection that had been forgotten in the machinery of corporate ambition. "There's a letter," Michael said, pulling out a faded envelope. "From Mum to Tommy, written just before she left." The letter was simple but powerful. Sarah explained the friendship between the families, her promise to Amy, and her deep regret at failing to keep it. She wrote of Tommy's visits to their house as a toddler, of his mother's pride in his intelligence and kind heart, of the bond between the two families that should have been maintained. "I remember now," Tommy said softly. "Your mother used to read to me when my mom was working late shifts." She had a way of doing different voices for each character. Matthew's hands trembled as he held the photographs. All this time we were already family, not by blood, but by choice, by the promises our wives made to each other, promises I forgot in my pursuit of wealth and power. The discovery shed new light on Michael's actions before the factory accident. His friendship with James Carter, his attempts to protect the workers, his establishment of the trust fund for Tommy, all of it had been an unconscious attempt to honor the connection between their families. "Maybe that's why I couldn't just walk away when I saw you that day with the flat tire," Tommy mused. "Something felt familiar, even if I didn't know why." The revelation brought both healing and pain: healing in understanding the deeper bonds that connected them, pain in recognizing how those bonds had been neglected. It wasn't just corporate negligence that had failed Tommy, it was the breaking of a sacred promise between two mothers who had tried to protect their children's futures. "We can't change the past," Matthew said, looking at the photos of happier times, "but we can honor their promise now, not just through legal obligations or corporate responsibility, but as the family we were always meant to be." Michael gathered the photographs, the diary, the letter pieces of a shared history they were only now discovering. These weren't just artifacts of the past, they were a blueprint for the future, a reminder that true family transcends blood relations and corporate boundaries. As evening fell, the three men sat together, surrounded by evidence of connections they'd forgotten and bonds they were rediscovering. The path forward was clearer. Now they weren't just fighting to reform a company or right past wrongs. They were fulfilling a promise made between two mothers, rebuilding a family that had been lost but never truly broken. The full truth about the Carter manufacturing accident emerged through an unexpected source. Late one evening, a security guard from the old factory arrived at Matthew's mansion, carrying a heavy box of maintenance logs and security footage he'd secretly preserved. James Carter knew the guard, Bill Anderson explained. He'd been documenting everything: the ignored safety warnings, the delayed repairs, the corners being cut. That's why he was in the control room that day. He was gathering final proof. The documents painted a damning picture. Months before the accident, James Carter had compiled extensive evidence of safety violations. He'd worked with Michael, building a case that could force the company to address the dangerous conditions. The explosion hadn't been a random accident, it was the direct result of systematic negligence. The pressure gauges had been malfunctioning for weeks, Bill continued, showing them the maintenance requests. James kept filing reports, but orders from above marked them non-critical to save money. He knew it was a time bomb waiting to explode. Security footage from the day of the accident, previously thought destroyed, revealed James's final moments in horrifying clarity. He'd detected the imminent failure and immediately triggered the evacuation alarm. But instead of saving himself, he'd rushed to help others, knowing the danger he faced. He could have run, Tommy said quietly, watching his father on screen. He had time to get out. He chose to save others instead, Michael added, including my friend Sarah Collins and her 3 children. The most shocking revelation came from James's personal notebook, preserved by Bill. The final entry, written the morning of the accident, showed he'd planned to take his evidence public that very afternoon. He'd arranged a meeting with state safety inspectors and investigative reporters. "Your father wasn't just a victim," Matthew told Tommy, his voice breaking. "He was a whistleblower, a hero who died trying to prevent future tragedies." The evidence implicated everyone in the corporate hierarchy, including Matthew. His signatures appeared on documents denying urgent safety repairs, his initials marked urgent warnings as reviewed and dismissed. Each page added to the weight of his culpability. After the explosion, Bill continued, they moved fast. Files disappeared, computers were wiped, witnesses were silenced with settlements and threats. I kept these records because I owed it to James. He trusted me to help him gather evidence. Tommy absorbed every detail, finally understanding the full scope of his father's courage. He wasn't just in the wrong place at the wrong time. He died fighting against the system that put profits over people's lives. The truth transformed their understanding of the accident. James Carter emerged not as a random victim, but as a man who had fought to the end to protect others. His death wasn't just a tragedy, it was the silencing of a voice raised against corporate corruption. Wilson knew, Matthew realized, examining dated memos. He helped coordinate the cover-up. That's why he turned against us when we started asking questions. He knew the truth would eventually come out. The security footage showed one final, heart-wrenching detail. In the moments before the explosion, James had looked directly at the camera and mouthed words, "Clearly take care of Tommy." He'd known the risks, understood he might not survive, but chose to stay and save others anyway. Bill Anderson watched as they processed the revelations. James often talked about Tommy, about wanting to build a safer world for his son. He believed one person standing up for what's right could make a difference. The truth brought both pain and purpose. James Carter's death wasn't just an industrial accident to be compensated and forgotten. It was a sacrifice made in the pursuit of justice, a father's final attempt to protect not just his son, but all children whose parents worked in dangerous conditions. As they reviewed the evidence late into the night, Tommy found a kind of peace in understanding his father's final actions. The grief remained, but now it was accompanied by pride and a deeper sense of purpose. His father had died not just as a victim of corporate greed, but as a hero fighting against it. Armed with Bill Anderson's evidence, the path to justice finally became clear. Matthew called an emergency press conference, standing beside Tommy and Michael as he revealed the full truth about the Carter manufacturing disaster. The media storm was immediate and overwhelming. For years, we buried not just the truth about the accident, but the story of a hero, Matthew announced to the assembled reporters. James Carter died trying to prevent a tragedy we should have heeded warnings about. Today we honor his sacrifice by exposing the full truth. The evidence was irrefutable. James Carter's documented warnings, the preserved security footage, and the maintenance logs created a clear timeline of corporate negligence and courage. State investigators reopened the case, this time with no corporate interference to hinder their work. Wilson and his allies attempted to discredit the new evidence, but their efforts backfired spectacularly. Former employees, emboldened by the truth's emergence, came forward with their own testimonies. The dam of silence broke, releasing a flood of long-suppressed truths. "Your father's evidence didn't die with him," Matthew told Tommy as they watched the investigations unfold. "He made sure the truth would survive, even if he didn't." The justice system moved swiftly. Wilson and several other executives faced criminal charges for their roles in the cover-up. The board members who had supported him found themselves under federal investigation. The corporate machine that had once seemed invincible began to crumble. But true redemption came not through legal victories, but through transformation. Matthew used his remaining influence to establish the James Carter Foundation for Industrial Safety, with Tommy as its head. The foundation's mission was simple: prevent other families from suffering similar losses. "We're not just seeking justice for the past," Tommy announced at the foundation's launch. "We're building safeguards for the future. My father died protecting others. His legacy will live on in every life saved by improved safety measures." The foundation's first act was to establish the James Carter Whistleblower Protection Program, ensuring that future safety concerns would be heard and addressed. They also created engineering scholarships for students focused on industrial safety improvements. Michael took charge of reforming Evans Manufacturing, implementing every safety measure his father had once championed. The company became a model for corporate responsibility, proving that ethical business practices and profitability could coexist. The most powerful moment of redemption came when Tommy, now officially part of the Evans family, unveiled a new memorial at the factory site. Unlike the old one, this memorial told the full story of his father's sacrifice and the long journey to truth. "Justice isn't just about punishing wrongdoing," Tommy said at the dedication ceremony. "It's about transforming the systems that allowed wrong to flourish. Today we honor not just those we lost, but the better future they died trying to create." Matthew stood beside him, no longer the ruthless corporate titan, but a man humbled and transformed by truth. Redemption, he reflected, comes not from erasing our mistakes, but from learning from them and working to ensure they're never repeated. The Carter manufacturing disaster had cost 13 lives, but its truth now saved countless others. James Carter's courage, preserved through his son's perseverance, and the Evans family's redemption became a catalyst for industry-wide reform. As Tommy, Matthew, and Michael stood together at the new memorial, they represented more than just the union of two families. They embodied the possibility of transformation, proof that even the darkest corporate sins could be redeemed through truth, justice, and unwavering commitment to doing what's right. The truth had finally set them all free, not just from lies and cover-ups, but from the burden of being less than they could be. James Carter's legacy lived on, not just in memory, but in every life saved by the changes his sacrifice ultimately inspired. The final piece of healing came on a warm spring morning, exactly 3 years after the fateful roadside meeting between Matthew and Tommy. A car pulled up the mansion's long driveway. Sarah Evans had returned home. Michael's letters had finally reached her in London, sharing the story of redemption, transformation, and the unexpected family connections they'd discovered. She arrived carrying her own burden of guilt, remembering the promise she'd made to Amy Carter years ago. "I should have fought harder," she told Tommy, meeting him for the first time since he was a toddler. "Your mother was my dearest friend, and I let her family down when you needed help most." Tommy, now thriving under the Evans' care and excelling in his engineering studies, took her hands in his. "You came back. That's what matters now." The reunion brought tears and laughter as Sarah shared stories about Tommy's mother, filling in the gaps in his memories. She brought photographs, letters, and mementos from the friendship between the two families that had been forgotten for so long. "Your mother was the strongest person I knew," Sarah told Tommy. "She fought her illness with such grace, always more worried about you than herself. She'd be so proud of the man you've become." Matthew watched his estranged wife reconnect with their son and with Tommy, seeing how the boy had inadvertently helped heal more than just corporate wounds. The family that had fractured under the weight of ambition and neglect was finding its way back together. Elizabeth, Matthew's daughter, arrived from London the following day. Initially skeptical about the changes in her father, she found herself drawn to Tommy's quiet strength and brilliant mind. The brother she'd never expected became the bridge to understanding her father's transformation. "He's different with you," she told Tommy one evening. "More human, more present. It's like you helped him remember who he was before the company consumed him." The mansion, once a showcase of wealth and power, transformed into a true home. Family dinners became a nightly ritual, filled with conversation and genuine connection. The library, where Tommy and Matthew had first bonded over engineering books, became the heart of the house. Sarah and Matthew's reconciliation was gradual but genuine. She saw in his relationship with Tommy the man she'd first fallen in love with, someone capable of great care and commitment when he chose the right priorities. "I'm sorry I lost my way," Matthew told her one evening as they walked through the garden she'd once loved. "It took losing everything to understand what really mattered." The healing extended beyond the immediate family. Michael's environmental initiatives at Evans Manufacturing brought positive change to the community. Elizabeth's international connections helped expand the James Carter Foundation's reach globally. Sarah's medical connections strengthened their workplace safety programs. Tommy, surrounded by love and support, flourished. His innovative safety designs were being implemented across industries. He spoke at conferences, sharing his father's story and the importance of corporate responsibility. The scared, homeless boy had become a powerful advocate for change. The most touching moment came when Sarah discovered Amy Carter's old diary among her belongings. In it, both mothers had written their hopes for their children's futures. The final entry, written by Amy shortly before her death, seemed prophetic. "If anything happens to me, I dream that our families will remain connected. That Tommy will know the love and support that Sarah and her family have always shown us. That the bond between mothers will become a bridge for our children." Reading those words together, the expanded Evans family understood that their reunion wasn't just healing past wounds, it was fulfilling long-held hopes and promises. Family isn't just about blood, Tommy reflected, looking around at the people who had become his family through choice and circumstance. It's about who stays when things are hardest, who helps you become your best self. The mansion's halls, once echoing with emptiness, now rang with the sounds of family life. Each room held new memories of reconciliation and joy, layered over the old ones of isolation and ambition. Together, they were writing a new chapter in their family story, one where past mistakes served as lessons rather than barriers, where healing came through honesty and connection, and where love proved stronger than corporate power or social status. The transformation of Evans Manufacturing became a case study in corporate reform. Under Michael's leadership, with Tommy's innovations and Matthew's guidance, the company pioneered a new model of ethical business practice that proved profitability and responsibility could coexist. The James Carter Safety Initiative, implemented across all Evans facilities, set new industry standards. Tommy's designs, born from his understanding of both engineering principles and real-world conditions, revolutionized industrial safety systems. Workers reported feeling not just safer, but valued and respected. "What we're building here," Tommy explained to a group of industry leaders, "is more than just safety protocols. It's a culture where every worker knows their life matters more than profit margins." The changes rippled outward. Other companies, facing pressure from workers and shareholders, began adopting similar practices, the Evans model. As it became known, demonstrated that ethical business practices could actually enhance profitability through reduced accidents, increased worker loyalty, and improved public trust. Matthew, stepping back from direct management, focused on mentoring the next generation of business leaders. He turned his executive training programs upside down, emphasizing ethical decision-making and human impact alongside financial metrics. I spent decades teaching people how to maximize profits, he told his students. Now I teach them how to maximize humanity while staying profitable. The two aren't mutually exclusive. The James Carter Foundation expanded its reach globally. They established training centers in developing countries, helping implement safety standards in regions where workers had little protection. Tommy traveled extensively, sharing his father's story and the importance of prioritizing human life over corporate profits. Sarah's medical background proved invaluable in developing comprehensive worker health programs. She established on-site wellness centers at major facilities, ensuring workers had access to preventive care and mental health support. The program reduced both accidents and healthcare costs, proving that caring for workers was good business. Elizabeth's international connections helped spread the message globally. She organized conferences bringing together industry leaders, workers' rights advocates, and safety experts. The dialogue led to voluntary adoption of higher safety standards across multiple industries. The most significant change came in corporate culture. Evans Manufacturing became known as a place where speaking up about safety concerns was encouraged and rewarded. The James Carter Whistleblower Protection Program, named in honor of Tommy's father, ensured that safety warnings would never again go unheeded. "Every worker who goes home safely to their family is a tribute to my father's sacrifice," Tommy said at the program's launch. "And every safety improvement we implement helps ensure other children won't lose their parents to preventable accidents." The company's success challenged long-held beliefs about corporate responsibility. Profits remained strong while accident rates plummeted. Employee satisfaction soared, turnover decreased, and productivity improved. Other companies began sending representatives to study their methods. Michael implemented innovative worker participation programs, giving employees a voice in safety decisions and profit sharing. The sense of ownership and responsibility transformed factory floors from places of risk to communities of mutual care and pride. Research universities partnered with the foundation to study the impact of their reforms. The data was clear: prioritizing worker safety and well-being not only saved lives but strengthened bottom lines. The studies became required reading in business schools, helping shape a new generation of corporate leaders. Local communities around Evans facilities flourished. The company's commitment to ethical practices attracted other businesses, creating economic growth without sacrificing worker protection. They proved that corporate success and community well-being could grow together. Tommy's role evolved from safety innovator to inspirational leader. His story from homeless youth to corporate reformer resonated with people at all levels of the organization. He embodied the possibility of positive change and the power of maintaining humanity in the face of adversity. "What we're creating here isn't just a safer workplace," Tommy told a gathering of workers and executives. "We're building a model for how business can serve both profit and people. My father died trying to protect others. His sacrifice reminds us that every decision we make affects real lives." The positive changes they implemented proved more profitable than the old ways of cutting corners and ignoring risks. Evans Manufacturing became living proof that ethical business practices weren't just morally right, they were good business strategy. As their model spread, they created something even more valuable than profits: hope. Hope that corporations could be forces for positive change, that business success didn't require sacrificing human values, and that one family's tragedy could transform into countless lives saved. 5 years after the roadside encounter that changed everything, Matthew stood with Tommy at the dedication of the new James Carter Center for Corporate Ethics. The gleaming building, built on the site of the old factory, represented everything they had fought to achieve. "My father believed in the power of individual choices," Tommy addressed the crowd. "One person's decision to help a stranger, to stand up for what's right, to value human life over profit, these choices create ripples that can change the world." The center became a hub for corporate reform, training future business leaders in ethical decision-making while honoring the legacy of those lost in the accident. Pictures of all 13 victims lined the entrance hall, reminding visitors of the human cost of corporate negligence. Matthew, now in his 80s but still sharp, spent his days mentoring young executives. His own story, from ruthless corporate titan to champion of ethical business, served as a powerful testament to the possibility of change. Success isn't measured in dollars, he often told his students. It's measured in lives improved, in families protected, in communities strengthened. I learned this lesson late, but thanks to a boy's simple act of kindness, I learned it well. Sarah established a scholarship program for children of industrial workers, ensuring that financial constraints wouldn't prevent talented students from pursuing their dreams. The program, named in honor of Amy Carter, specifically supported those interested in engineering and workplace safety. Michael and Elizabeth worked together to expand their father's legacy internationally. The Evans model of ethical business practice was adopted by companies worldwide, proving that conscience and commerce could coexist profitably. But perhaps the most meaningful legacy was the simple tradition Tommy established. Every year, on the anniversary of their first meeting, he and Matthew changed a tire together at the same spot on Route 27. The ritual reminded them of how a small act of kindness had triggered a cascade of positive change. "You know what I've realized," Tommy said during one such anniversary. "That day when I stopped to help you, I wasn't just fixing a tire. I was helping fix something much bigger, even if I didn't know it then." Matthew smiled, remembering the boy who had refused payment for his help. "And I wasn't just a stranded driver. I was a man who had lost his way, being shown the path back to humanity by a child who had every reason to turn his back on the world." Their story became legend in Louisville business circles, the homeless boy who helped the millionaire, the act of kindness that sparked corporate reform, the unlikely family forged through tragedy and redemption. More importantly, it became a blueprint for change. Other companies learned that ethical practices and profitability weren't mutually exclusive. Other executives saw that it's never too late to choose a different path. Other families learned that healing can come from the most unexpected sources. As sunset painted the sky over the James Carter Center, Tommy and Matthew stood together, looking at what they had built. The legacy they created wasn't just in the buildings, programs, or reforms, it was in the countless lives touched by their journey from that first roadside encounter to this moment. "My father used to say that true wealth isn't what you have," Tommy reflected, "but what you give." Matthew nodded, putting his arm around the young man who had become like a son to him. "And true legacy isn't what you leave behind, but what you change while you're here." Together, they had transformed a story of loss and corporate greed into one of redemption and positive change. Their legacy would live on in every worker who returned safely to their family, every whistleblower who found the courage to speak up, and every business leader who chose conscience over profit. Thank you for experiencing this emotional journey with us. If this story of redemption, human kindness, and corporate transformation moved you, please take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments below. Your insights and perspectives enrich our storytelling community. Subscribe to our channel for more compelling narratives that explore the depths of human nature and social change. Help spread these important messages by sharing this video with friends and family. Every like, share, and subscription supports our team in creating meaningful content that challenges us to reflect on what truly matters in life. Together we can inspire positive change through the power of storytelling.